Stephanie Dobson is back with us this week. Stephanie is a local lawyer and mediator with Henka Divorce Law and Mediation here in Lloydminster. We've been spending quite some time now talking about all the different aspects of divorce, and today, Stephanie, we're going to be talking about the cost of divorce. So thank you once again for joining us, and I will ask you to start out by basically explaining if you can kind of break down what a cost would be involved with people going through separation and divorce.
Sure. And I'm going to start out by just making a general comment that today we're talking about the financial costs. But one of the things to recognize about the word cost is there's so many different areas of how a divorce can cost someone besides the finances. So we can talk about the emotional costs, the opportunity costs, the psychological costs, the community costs. There's all sorts of different. But today our focus is on the financial costs of divorce. So I want to give our viewers a little bit better of an answer than sometimes what we have to say is it depends, right? It depends on your situation as far as how much the actual dollar will be at the end. But there's a couple of ways that I charge for my services, and this is quite standard within the divorce community. So I'll just describe my ways. So number one is number one, secondly, we'll talk about flat fee, but number one, we'll talk about the hourly services. So these would be for things negotiations leading up to agreement or your final court order within your divorce. So most lawyers will charge by the interval of an hour. So for me, I charge by the 0.1 of an hour. So that is on the 6-minute intervals. There's some lawyers that charge on the 15-minute intervals. Those are the minimum amount of time. If I work on your file, there will be a 0.1 of an hour on your invoice. It's really best to talk to your lawyer about how they bill. If they do hourly, what their interval will be that they bill by. Now, on the flat fee services, this is typically once the negotiations have completed and the lawyer is drafting documentation. So for me, those would be things like drafting a separation agreement or drafting your final divorce documentation.
And Stephanie, what are some of the things that contribute to the costs as things continue to go up? What are some of the I guess the issues that you would deal with that would cause those costs to escalate?
And so this is, again, where this is the big picture of it depends, because there's really three main things that I like to focus on. So number one is the level of conflict between two spouses. So the higher the conflict, the more time it's going to take to resolve that particular issue. Number two, the negotiation process choice. So we've been talking a lot about negotiation process, mediation, collaborative divorce court, the do-it-yourself option in some previous episodes. But for example, the litigation process can be procedurally more intensive, and so the costs can escalate. Whereas sometimes when we can keep it out of court, if you're spending money on one meeting, for example, one 2-hour meeting, we're containing your costs to that 2-hour meeting. And the third thing is the number of issues. So very basically, how many issues do we need to resolve? And the key with this is that this is like a puzzle. So we could have one issue with tons of conflict and a divorce court process that costs a whole lot of money and takes a whole lot of time, or we could have 15 issues that are resolved out of court with very little conflict. So it really is a puzzle that we have to put together in each particular situation.
Stephanie, does it help if couples discuss a lot of this ahead of time with the costs? Can that be helpful at all?
Well, this can be a little bit of a double-edged sword. So I always do recommend that the families that come to meet with me, that they do some of the legwork themselves ahead of time. In fact, my most useful tool when I work with families is the workbook that I use called Our Family in Two Homes. And that will go through a series of questions, and it will give the families some legal information on which they can start to base their proposals, their ideas, their resolution. And families can do this either alone when they use their workbook, or they can each get a workbook if they're using mediation, and they can actually discuss their proposal ahead of time. So my rule of thumb is, as long as it's productive and constructive discussion between the two of you, definitely try to discuss things yourselves. But as soon as it becomes a little bit more emotionally drawn, it might be better just to leave it for the discussion with the professionals.
Are there some ways that couples can keep their expenses in check when they're going through this process?
Absolutely. We talked earlier, of course, about process choice and keeping the conflict de-escalated. So those ones are obvious ones that we've already gone through. But I want to give 3 further tips. So my tip number 3 is to use professionals wisely. Someone might want to use a counselor to help them with the emotional component of their separation. A realtor could help both parties to negotiate the listing of their home instead of having the lawyers do it at that hourly rate. And you may want to work with a financial advisor, for example, to talk about settlement and what you might need for savings in your post-separation world, what a budget might look like in your household. You can work with other professionals to help to round that out. Tip number 2 is to get informed. Now, of course, this is my big passion, and this is exactly why I've created my e-learning community, Up a Notch Learning. Viewers can go and check that out if they wish. There's a whole lot of free resources that help people to start to understand some of those topics around separation and divorce and to get informed. Being informed will help you to make decisions and to stay in the driver's seat as you go through your separation and divorce. And tip number 1, the final one, is to use your divorce professional wisely. If you have questions, for example, that aren't time sensitive, you might want to get a note on your phone and start to type in a few different questions that you have and to group them together and to write one email instead of writing 4 emails, for example, for 4 different topics. As well, at my office, I know, for example, we don't charge for our assistance time. So our clients will often be in really good contact with our assistants to be able to answer some of their questions that are not legal related, but they're more routine questions, and that can really save a lot of costs.
All right, Stephanie, well, good information once again, and we appreciate you joining us. We'll talk to you again next week.
You bet. Thanks, Stacey.